Welcome everybody at this session of Studium Generale. Tonight we have a very interesting program, Russia through the eyes of Tom Vennink. I will introduce Tom to you in a couple of moments. A very relevant topic, perhaps also dramatic, because Russia, you really loved Russia, you lived there for 6 years, is nowadays in very bad shape. And we don't know what the future will bring, but we'll talk about it later on, of course. It's also an exciting evening in another way, because I think right now Putin is addressing the nation together with his Minister of Defense, and it's very uncertain what it will be about. Perhaps a mobilization of the Russian people. We will see and wait for the outcome. Okay, Tom Vennink. Tom Vennink lived for 6 years in Russia, a country he fell in love with. Love also brought him to Russia. He's a journalist for the Dutch magazine the Volkskrant, the Dutch newspaper I should say. And in 2021 Tom was expelled from Russia. He got a letter which said you need to leave the country within 3 days. And it was a very obscure reason, still today, I think, Tom, the reason. Yeah. So he had to leave. In the meantime, Russia invaded Ukraine, so things got much worse. We are, of course, very curious how Tom Vennink sees his beloved Russia these days. We have lots of questions. Will the biggest country on earth be some kind of black spot on the globe? How and when will this terrible war end? There are so many questions. Tom knows a lot about Russia, also about how the people think in Russia. Perhaps he even knows how Vladimir Putin thinks. That will be one of the questions. But so you can prepare yourself for that one, Tom. I want a very big hand for Tom Vennink.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I would like to introduce you to someone I met on one of my recent reporting trips. It was a reporting trip in Ukraine, in a city called Zhytomyr. It's not far from Kiev. I was there in the beginning of this year. The war had just started, and I met a young guy called Sasha Kruk. This is how I met him. He's standing in front of what was once his house, and he told me that he had been building it for 12 years together with his wife, Luda. And they were so happy together. They were celebrating that Sasha had come back from the front line in the eastern part of Ukraine, where there was already a war. He had returned after 5 years. 5 years at the front line. He was home. Next to the house, you can't see it here, was a car. The car, a new car that he used to drive Luda with to the Carpathian Mountains. It was her 33rd birthday, and he took her on a trip to the mountains. Yeah, their house was done, finally, after 12 years. The only thing that was still left to do was to finish the room for their second child. Their second child was expected to be born this fall, so right now. And I saw Sasha standing there, and you can see the bag that he has there, and he was planning to come here and to find things that were still intact after the explosion, and gather them, put them in the bag. That was his plan, but he was just standing there, not moving, just looking at his house. He just couldn't move. And he was especially looking at this part of the house, and he said to me that that was the part where he was sitting on the bed together with Luba when the explosion hit, when the bomb fell. Both of them were blown through the room, and Sasha looked around after the explosion and saw Luda lying on the other side of the room. He crawled to her, but when he came to her, she wasn't breathing anymore. He was taken to the hospital by his father, who came running into the room. And that was the last time he saw Luda. I walked around through Zhytomyr. I met more people standing outside, even though the sirens were constantly ringing. The siren that means there could be a new attack coming. And we could see the Russian planes in the air, and they were fast, and they were coming right at the city, possibly planning to drop a new bomb. And I saw Olga Borisova standing, and I decided also to talk to her. She was standing in front of the studio where she had been working for 18 years, repairing shoes and clothes. And she had come to find the machine that she had been sewing these clothes with for 18 years. And she told me that she said she had no right to be sad because she's still alive. But many people in Zhytomyr were not. And she was very sad, not only because of what happened to her shop, but also she was also very sad when she talked to her brother. Her brother is from Russia. She herself is from Russia. She's born in Siberia. She has been living in Ukraine for a long time, but her brother is still in Russia. And she called her brother, explaining what had happened to her city, to the people in her city, and to her own studio where she had been working for 18 years. And her brother said, you think that it was the Russian army that bombed your shop? No, it was the Ukrainian army that did that. You shouldn't believe what the Ukrainians tell you. Russia is coming to finally liberate you.
Sure.
And I went back, and when I was sitting in the car on my way back to the Netherlands, I was thinking, who's responsible for this? Is it Vladimir Putin, the president? Or is it the soldiers who dropped those bombs? Perhaps it's the brother of Olga who's also responsible. In other words, maybe the Russian population has a responsibility here. The people I had been living with for 6 years in Moscow. For me, Russia started with love. In 2013, I met my girlfriend Sasha. We met in London. We were both studying in London. I went back to the Netherlands, he went back to Moscow, and I started visiting Russia. And my knowledge of Russia was quite limited. It was influenced by YouTube. But I discovered a Russia that I didn't know when I moved to Moscow. This was the view that I had from my apartment building in Moscow. I was looking at the city center. All the way in the back you see right there the high new skyscrapers of big state companies. You see one of the, we call them seven sisters of Stalin. Stalin built 7 of those high skyscrapers. And this was my base, and from here I traveled all over the country. My job was to explain to people who would read the Volkskrant what was happening in Russia, and if possible, why it was happening. That was often the hard part of my job. But yeah, I did see a country that was very much like ours, like the Netherlands. I went to Tomsk. It's a student city in Siberia, to talk to people, to talk to young people who grew up after the Soviet Union, who also have smartphones, who are just like us, to find out how they are looking at their country, at their lives, at Putin. So I found 5 people there who were born in the first months of Putin's presidency in 2000. And they had all grown up. They were 18 years old here. And they called themselves the freest Russian generation ever. They were studying the things that they wanted to study. They could choose themselves. They were going out to bars. They were dreaming of traveling around the world. Some of them already had seen India, the US. They were very happy with their lives. For example, Lena, one of them, she was born on day 15 of Putin's presidency. She's a musician, and I asked her, so it's the first time that you can vote now, because it was just before presidential elections. And I asked her, what are you going to vote? And she said, I'm not going to vote. Because the president that we have has made Russia very stable. Russia is stable in all spheres, she said. I'm happy with my life, I don't need change. So why would I vote? I also talked to medical students. Andrei. Andrei wasn't very happy with the salaries of doctors in Russia. That's why, yeah, he saw room for improvement. But compared to his parents, he said, yeah, Russia is more stable than in the 90s, than in the Soviet Union. So Andrei said, I wrote down his quote, he said, Putin has turned a poor and chaotic country into a reasonably prosperous and stable one. And he said, no, I'm going to vote for Putin because maybe he can change the country one more time in the future. I was traveling a lot, also in the north. I saw development, especially in oil and gas industry. It was just after, I came to Russia just after the annexation of Crimea. So there were some sanctions and the ruble was a bit weakened, and the big growth of the 2000s when Russia's economy skyrocketed was over. But still things were okay. And I saw a lot of development, especially in the north. This is Murmansk. In Murmansk, I visited a nuclear power plant. Russia is leading in nuclear energy. It's building nuclear power plants all over the world. And this is a power plant that's it's actually floating. It's a ship. So you can move this power plant around. I talked to Vladimir Iriminko, one of the senior engineers at the ship, and he was so proud. He was so proud that he was part of the team that made the first floating nuclear power plant in the world. And he told me, it's like you're an engineer and you're of the first rocket that goes to space. He said it's the first. It's not the second or the third. It's the first. We won, and I'm part of it. This is Moscow, where I found a very modern country, a very modern city with modern arts, with nice bars, with everything that you have in any big city in the West. And I had a very comfortable life there, and the Russians around me as well. You can order your food there very easily. They're quicker than here. They have a company called Yandex. It's like Uber, Amazon, and Google, but then in one company. So you can wake up with the Yandex alarm clock. Then you order a Yandex taxi, you go to your job. You order Yandex food for lunch. You watch TV through Yandex, everything. It's super modern, and yeah, if you're lucky and you order food, you get this robot that brings you your vegetarian lunch. I joined a running club as well. This is the running club that they used to run with every weekend. I did the things that the Russians around me were also doing. For example, they run marathons. Yeah, like runners in the Netherlands also do. But they run marathons in Siberia, in winter, over a frozen lake. At minus 29. So yeah, I joined them and it was a lot of fun. But before the start, I was warned that the year before there was a snowstorm during the marathon, and it was unexpected. And at this photo, you can see the other side of the lake, because that's what you do. You cross the lake, the Baikal Lake, the lake with the most water in the world, and it's 42 kilometers broad, but it's 700 kilometers long. So if it starts snowing and you don't see anymore where you are, you can get into trouble. And that's what had happened the year before. The organizers decided to cancel the race when they were halfway because it was too dangerous. But they couldn't find the first runner back. He was gone. There was a Chinese runner they put in hospital because he was frozen. And the first runner they found only 2 kilometers before the end. And I asked, well, did he want to finish because he was so far? But they said no, he was about to die. He went into the hovercraft and was saved. But during my runs, I also saw this guy every Saturday at 10 in the morning on my running loop in the center of Moscow. And it's Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition. And he was every week there. Sometimes he wasn't there. It meant he was in jail. But he would always come back. That was the time. Of course, in politics, lots had happened before. Boris Nemtsov, another opposition politician, had been killed next to the Kremlin in 2015. And a lot of opposition politicians had gone to jail, but they would always come out and continue their work. And the work of Navalny for me, it was fascinating to watch. He published these investigations in which he would really show how corruption works in Russia. He would take drones. Let's just watch a bit. So he's showing how Medvedev, the former president, got rich, and what he actually owns, because that's a big secret.
Мы с вами находимся в районе села Знаменское. Это ближайшее Подмосковье, Рублево-Успенское шоссе. Здесь самая дорогая в России земля, самые шикарные дома за самыми высокими заборами.
He just takes a drone and flies over all these estates and shows that they own not only these huge houses but also castles, not only in Russia but also in Italy. The guys who were always criticizing the West actually like to relax in the West. Navalny was showing all of that. And I wanted to see how corruption affects people in daily life, like normal Russians. How can it hit you? And I've made many stories about how that worked, but one story still sticks to me, and that's the story of the man on the left, Murtazali Ghassan Gusenov from Dagestan. Dagestan is a republic in the Caucasus, in the south. And he's from a very poor area. It's one of the poorest areas in Russia. He was a shepherd. He was ill. His wife was also ill, and they had 2 sons, both shepherds. And they used to go to with sheep to pasture. But at one day they called home and they said, okay, we start walking home now after a couple of days in the mountains. They said, we start walking home now, can you please prepare some food because we're really hungry. But they never came home. You see the brothers behind him, his sons, 2 sons. They were found dead with machine guns next to them in military uniforms, and the police presented them as terrorists. Dagestan is known for some incidents with terrorism in the past, and the police was saying, well, we killed some terrorists, Russia is safer. But no one in the village believed that those 2 guys were actually terrorists, because everyone knew them in the village and they were just shepherds. The bodies were brought to the village by the police, and then something special happened, because the villagers didn't trust the police, and they took the bodies from the police and brought them to the mosque and had a look at the bodies. And what they found was that one of the brothers had 8 bullet holes in his body. But in the coat, in the military uniform around him, there were only 3. And they started thinking. And they understood that, okay, that means that he must have been shot first, then he must have taken on the coat, and then he was shot again. And they started investigating what had happened, and they found out that these 2 boys were killed because the head of the police wanted to make a promotion. He wanted to show that he was fighting terrorism. in this poor area, and he thought, you know, these poor shepherds who are ill, they're not gonna go to court, you know. But he went to court. And in Russia, if you go to court against the police and the security service of Russia, you have a very small chance to win. And yeah, he lost. And he went to another court, he lost. He went to Moscow, he lost. He lost everywhere. But Russia was part of the Council of Europe. And that means that he could go to the European Court of Human Rights. That's what he did. Murtaza Ali, from the poor shepherd from Dagestan, went to the European Court of Human Rights. He found the way. And he won. He won. That's how corruption can hit your life in Russia, I understood. And this was all, I was making these stories and then coming back to Moscow, and you know, I would do my run, go to the nice supermarkets with all these fresh products from all over the world, and going to a bar, and life was just going on. And then I would make these stories and come back home and think, wait a second, like, this is happening at the same time. And during my years in Russia, I started thinking about that more and more, and it was troubling me. I also met Ruslan. He's part of Navalny's team. And while Navalny would, every week, sometimes he would be in jail, but he would come back. But Ruslan was sent to Nova Zembla. It's all the way up north. It's almost on the North Pole. They took him from his house. The police took him from his house, Russian police, in the middle of the night, put him in a plane without telling him anything. He walked out of the second plane after making a stop in Murmansk, and he understood that he was in Nova Zembla. And then they told him, yeah, it's time for your military service. You have to spend a year here. And what he saw was a little shed, a wooden shed, bears. There were actually bears lying next to it. And that's where he had to spend a year. And he had no chance to inform his family what had happened. His family didn't know where he was. He was not allowed to contact them. And they only later found out that where he was, they were scared that he had died. And I saw the repression getting stronger and stronger in Russia. There would be protests, especially after election rigging or after one of Navalny's investigations. People would go to the streets, they would be arrested. Most of the arrested people would be free the next day. And this was going on like in waves. Sometimes you would have a wave of protest, a couple of weeks, and then everyone found out that it wasn't possible to change the system. Then they went home, and then a new scandal happened, and people went to the street. This was ongoing. But in general, for Putin, things were stable. And then municipal elections were coming up, and everyone expected the same thing. Because Putin in the end would win, his candidates would win, opposition candidates would not be allowed to participate. So it was quite predictable, I thought. And then the biggest moment of my correspondence years in Russia happened. I got news from a Russian news site that a plane carrying Navalny had made an emergency landing in Omsk, in Siberia, and Navalny was unconscious. And I immediately thought, okay, this is not just an accident. So I took a plane and flew to Omsk. And there I came to a hospital, and his wife on the right was standing outside together with his colleagues. And the only thing they knew, they were told, was that, yeah, Navalny had fallen unconscious, he's in the hospital, but they were not allowed to go in, they were not allowed to see him, they were not allowed to talk to the doctor. They weren't even allowed to go in the building of the hospital. And I was standing here and I thought that, yeah, people started talking about the possibility that Navalny had been poisoned. And I saw people in black suits going into the building, and they didn't look like doctors. So it was clear that the security services had taken over the decision-making process in a medical hospital. They were deciding, is he gonna live, is he not gonna live? He lived because, due to international pressure, Navalny was allowed, Putin agreed to let Navalny out by a medical plane, and he was flown to Berlin. He recovered miraculously from a chemical weapon called Novichok. And he started doing what he was doing before. He started investigating the attack on his own life. And he managed to find, with the help of other investigators, like the investigation group Bellingcat and a few media, he found out that he found the identities of the people that were in the murder squad that had tried to kill him. And he even called one of them. He called a couple of them. Most of them just didn't answer when they understood it was Navalny talking. But he managed to talk to one of them, who
Привет, это Навальный.
actually started telling what had happened. Because Navalny pretended to be an officer of the Russian security service. Here you see him.
Да, Артем, привет.
Константин.
Алло.
Алло, Константин Борисович.
Да.
Здрасте, меня зовут Устинов Максим Сергеевич. Я помощник Николая Платоновича Патрушева. Мне ваш телефон дал Владимир Михайлович Богданов. Извините за ранний звонок, мне нужно 10 минут вашего времени, очень сильно нужно. Что?
Да, слушаю.
Руководство в очередной раз, новая итерация обсуждений.
The FSB agent thinks he's talking to a high boss from Moscow and starts answering questions about what happened in Omsk. And Navalny asks, so why is Navalny alive? Why did the operation fail? And the FSB agent said, yeah, it's because of an emergency landing. If the pilots would not have made that emergency landing, he would have died during the flight. And he started talking. He started explaining what they had done, how they had poisoned Navalny. The titles here say, already socks, a face mask, and a T-shirt. Yes. So the FSB agent is already saying which parts of Navalny's clothes they had poisoned.
Чтобы хорошо. По 10-бальной шкале вы оцениваете работу Александрова как? Понятно, что он ваш коллега, тем не менее.
Александрова?
Да.
Работа хорошая, да. Оцениваю хорошо.
Лидерские качества Таякина вы как оцениваете? Координацию команды?
Но Таякин там не был. Самочков был.
Я знаю, что там не было Таякина, что там был Осипов, но тем не менее Таякин в операции участвовал, правильно?
Честно, я не
сами как вы личность оцениваете?
могу ничего сказать.
Ну хорошо.
Да, нормально.
And the conversation takes 45 minutes. He's calling with the person who tried to call him for 45 minutes. Then Navalny decided to come back to Russia. It was very hard for me to understand, for many other people also to understand. Because why would you come back to the people that had already tried to kill you? And you know that they will be waiting for you. He came back. And I thought, okay, this is the moment. It was all clear now when he got arrested. It was all on YouTube, it was all, the facts, the evidence was there that the Russian security service that Putin had led before and is under the control of President Putin had tried to kill the only challenger to Putin himself, Alexei Navalny. It was clear. When Navalny came back, he was arrested immediately. The court case that followed was a farce. Everyone could see it. Every Russian person could see it. Even on the Russian internet, which is censored, but at that moment you could easily find it. So I thought, what is going to happen now? Are people just going to live on, do their runs and go to their cafes and just live on? Or are they going to say, we don't want to live in a country like this? There were protests in Moscow, in other cities. I decided to go to like a regular city. So I went to Novocherkassk. It's a city in the south, size of Enschede, has universities as well, international students. I went there and was really curious who I would find on the street. How many people would come here to protest and to show that they want to live in a country where you cannot kill the opposition leader? One. This is Yegor, a student. Out of 170,000 people, he was the only one who came to the square on the Saturday that the protest was announced for. And I asked him, like, hey, why did you come? And he gave me the story that I would always get from protesters, is that they want freedom, they don't want to live in a country like that. But I said, yeah, but why are you alone? Where's the rest? And he didn't really have an answer to that. He said, yeah, you know, other Russians are just living in a bubble. They're living in their own bubble, their small bubble. But it's actually the other way around. I thought it's Igor living in a bubble, because he's just one. All the others are together in one huge bubble. And I was so surprised by this, and because Novocherkassk, it's a city where people used to protest. In 1962, when prices were raised, people went on strike. Factory workers stopped working, went to the square, started striking. The strike lasted 2 days. On the second day, the army came and they shot everyone on the square. 25 people died Many were injured. Other participants ended up in the Gulag. There was a lot of blood on the square, and it was the same square where Yegor went to. But all this blood on the square was removed immediately. The same day, the whole square got new asphalt. And no one ever talked about it again. It was as if it had never happened. People in the city didn't talk about it. People who did talk about it went to Gulag, to the prison system that Stalin and Lenin had set up in the Soviet Union. Here are some of the victims, people who were shot that day. And some people survived. When I was in the city, there were also people still in the city who had been shot that day but survived. And I called one of them to ask her for an interview. It was an old lady, 72 years old. And I asked her whether she's ready to talk to me, but she said, you know, it's all too recent. It's too recent. It's too fresh. I can't talk about it yet. Because no one had ever talked about it, I understood. And it's the same goes for the whole history of the Soviet Union. The country never had the discussion that Germany had after the Second World War. They never agreed that the regime of the Soviet Union was inhumane and wrong. They never discussed that. They went into the 90s, it was all chaotic. The first years of democracy were unsafe, and some people even wanted to go back to the Soviet Union. Sometimes even people who have suffered in the Soviet Union want to go back to that time. And I thought, that's maybe part of the reason why Yegor was alone. What he did on that Saturday on the square where in 62 people had been killed, people like him, he took a bus to another city, a bigger city. He joined the protest. He was arrested after 20 minutes. He was brought back to Novocherkassk into the police prison. He spent 2 weeks there and got out and told his grandmother what happened. And his grandmother told, you better stay home, boy, because if you go out next time, you might end up like the people from 62. Yegor said he would continue protesting. But I talked to a few other people of his age and asked them why they didn't go protest, and they said, protesting means calling for a revolution, and revolutions are always bloody in Russia. So I'm not going to protest. I better just go to my classes, get my diploma, get a job, preferably in the Russian government, in one of the ministries, for example, because then you have stability. You go to IKEA, you pick your furniture, and you live the life that as good as you can in Russia. You make some trips, maybe to Crimea that had been annexed, you go there on holiday, you go to Turkey. You can live that life in Russia without engaging into politics. that moment, repression in Russia went into an overdrive. Russian critical media were getting into trouble. They were designated as foreign agents. It's an official word for enemy of the state, enemy of the Russian people. Human rights activists got into trouble. And an old man who spent his whole life investigating what happened in the Gulag system was sent to jail for 20 years. He will die in jail. But I was still looking at this as a foreign correspondent, someone who's safe, who was always safe, because we foreign correspondents, we don't influence public opinion in Russia. So we're not a threat for Putin. We're not a threat for the Kremlin. We just inform people in the Netherlands, but the Kremlin already knows that people in the Netherlands, they're critical of Russia anyway, so it doesn't matter. Sometimes you would be followed by the security services on a trip. I also experienced that a couple of times, but you know, it's Russia. I mean, it has a history of the Soviet Union. The security services are huge, so I've never felt intimidated because I thought there are so many people working at the FSB in this very small town in the north of Russia, where suddenly a Western journalist would show up. Yeah, of course they are interested in what he's doing. But that was that happened a lot in my last year in Russia, and a colleague of mine for the BBC was expelled. She came back to Russia after a trip outside of Russia and was told at the border, you are a security threat for Russia. You're not allowed to come in anymore. Dot. No more explanation. She was the first correspondent to be kicked out. I was the second. I had no idea that they would target the correspondent of the Volkskrant from the Netherlands. So I just went to this place where every year I would go here to prolong my accreditation. Those accreditations look like this, and it's like your get out of jail for free card. If you would be detained somewhere, you would show that card, and they would say, okay, you can go. But you would have to renew it every year, because it's your permit to work as a journalist, and you need it to get a visa. And every year it was a hassle to prolong it. You can see the reason here. Like, sometimes they would just close for unknown reasons, technical reasons they always say, and sometimes they were, making it a bit hard for us, like playing with us, asking for a letter not printed in black and white but in color. The Volkskrant has a stamp that Russians love stamps. It had a stamp, and it was a square stamp, but the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs suddenly said, yeah, we only accept round stamps. So the Volkskrant produced a round stamp just for me, and then it was accepted. But last year, in 2021, it didn't work. And here at number 3, I was told, when I expected to finally receive my visa, it had been horrible, but I was told your visa is ready. So I came there, but instead of a visa, I was handed a piece of paper, and it said, you have to leave Russia within 3 days. And your visa, your current visa, is revoked. And I immediately understood, okay, this is the end of my work in Russia, my life in Russia, because if they've decided this, they've decided that. They're not going to turn a decision around, a decision like that. And I also understood that it was not the woman behind number 3 who made that decision, but in Russia those decisions come from very high, probably in the Kremlin, or maybe the Minister of Foreign Affairs, probably the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure, and they're never going to tell me. But what they did tell me was, after a couple of weeks, they told me, yeah, you've committed 2 administrative offenses. I thought, which offenses? And he said, yeah, in 2019, you went to Chukotka. It's a province in the northeast of Russia. It's like the end of the world if you see the world map. And you haven't asked permission from the governor when you went there. But I had asked permission from the mayor, I had asked permission from the security service, just to take a plane and go there. The mayor had even agreed to an interview, but the governor, indeed, I had not asked him. So back then I got a fine of 5,000 rubles, which was 50 euros. I paid it, that was it, I thought. The second offense was not registering on a home address in time. In Russia, they still have this Soviet system of foreigners have to register themselves at the place where they sleep. So if you spend the night somewhere, you have to register in that municipality. It's a bit complicated for foreign journalists to travel around all the time, because if you come to Moscow, you need to go to a small agency on the other side of this huge city of Moscow with its 13 million people. And you can't only do it yourself, you have to take with you the owner of the house, so your landlord. So you do that, wait in line, have things like this, like it's so close, sorry, we don't work today. And when you manage to do that, and then you go on a trip, you visit the village, you spend the night there, you have to do the same there. There you can do it through a hotel, so it's easier, but if you stay not at the hotel but at someone's place, you need that person to come with you to the local, etc., etc. And then you come back to Moscow and then it starts all over again. And once in those 6 years, I didn't do that soon enough. I did it like in a month instead of after 6 days or whatever. I also paid that fine. It was years before this happened. So I'm sure it's not the real reason. So that's what happened to me. Now I'm reporting in Ukraine, and yeah, I have these questions like, who's responsible for what happened to Sasha? Who's responsible for what happened to Olga? I'm really curious to what you think, so I'm also going to ask this question to you. If someone has an idea, I'm very curious, because I haven't found the answer to the question. Because yeah, at one side there's the question, what can you do as a Russian? Yeah, you can protest, but maybe you can do also other things. Well, we can talk about it in a minute. I'm also standing here being nervous about what's happening right now in Russia, because at 7 o'clock our time, Putin was scheduled, he was always late, he was scheduled to start giving a speech together with the Minister of Defense. Yeah, and that doesn't happen often. What is he going to announce? Earlier today, the Luhansk region and the Donetsk region in the eastern part of Ukraine had said, we're gonna have a referendum to join Russia. If that happens, then according to Russia, that part of Ukraine will be part of Russia. It will be Russian land. And if you attack Russian land, Russia can defend itself with anything it has, including nuclear weapons. It can call for a general mobilization. That would mean that suddenly the war that is still very far away from people in Moscow would come very, very close. It would affect everyone's life in Russia. That's a really risky decision that Putin could possibly make. But yeah, he's the leader of the biggest country on earth already for how many years? 22 years now. He's never lost a conflict, a military conflict. He would always win. He's surrounded by people from the KGB, the Soviet Security Service, where he himself also served in. Is he gonna take a risk? Or does he even see it as a risk to go for a mobilization? It was said that I maybe know how Putin thinks. I still don't know, but I do know that it's possible that he would go for mobilization. And that would mean a new phase of the war, and that would mean nuclear threats. And yeah, and meanwhile, meanwhile in Russia, the people I talk to are telling me life is as it was before, as when you were here. The running group is still running. They had the Moscow Marathon was last Sunday. The shops are still open. Okay, IKEA closed, McDonald's closed, but there's already a new McDonald's and it's quite okay, I'm being told. Yeah, life is going on as it was, I hear, and that's, well, this is happening. So who's responsible? If anyone of you have an idea, please raise your hand. And I already see a hand. And also, I will give you the opportunity to ask any questions if you have them. Yeah.
First, a big hand for Tom.